Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, I'm Alfred Marcus, professor of strategy at the Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota. On this program, I aim to examine the intersection of strategy and ethics. Globalization is often described as if it were a natural force like the weather, inevitable and unstoppable. But Janick, Marina, Schaufelbuehl's new book, Crusading for Globalization, U.S. Multinationals and Their Opponents Since 1945, shows it was the result of deliberate strategies by powerful executives who built organizations, lobbied governments, and shaped world trade to serve their interests. At the same time, they faced fierce opposition from labor, protectionists, and leaders in the global South. This is a history of power and values, and it forces us to ask, who really makes globalization happen, and who benefits from it? Janick, welcome to the New Books Network. Could you tell us about your background and what drew you into researching globalization and multinational business? Did you set out to critique globalization, or did the evidence bring you there?
Thank you so much for inviting me to this podcast. I am a history professor at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and my research has evolved quite a bit since my PhD, in which I studied the question of European reconstruction in the early post-World War II years. Then I did some work with two colleagues on Swiss involvement in slavery and the transatlantic slave trade since the 16th century. And after that, I started a new project on transatlantic economic and political relations between the United States and Europe. And for this research, I spent 2 years in the United States, in Princeton first, and then later at Harvard and Columbia University. And I was during this time in the United States that the direction of my research changed, the research that led to this book. It was when I was working in different historical archives that I came across a business association called the United States Council for International Business that played an extraordinarily important role over the entire second half of the 20th century. But it was not well known. And it has not until now received any scholarly attention or much scholarly attention. And I believe this is because this association, the U.S. Council, avoided exposure. It was its strategy to fly under the radar of public attention. So there was hardly any literature on the U.S. Council, and in general, I feel there's still a lot more research to be done on U.S. business associations, even if there is some really great work of Ben Waterhouse, for instance, on the Business Roundtable, or Jennifer Delton on NAM, on the National Association for Manufacturers, and many others. But I wanted to further dig into the historical role of U.S. business associations, because business associations as such are very crucial political tools for business executives, which allow them to organize collectively and in that way to increase their sway on government and political processes, or towards social movements, or of course towards labor unions. So I decided to look at this business association, the U.S. Council, and its role in driving forward globalization. And I also included research on two other big business associations that participated in this dynamic, which are the NAM and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Very interesting. It's the U.S. Council for International Business plus NAM and the Chamber of Commerce who are the corporate globalizers in your book. These are especially the U.S. Council. And so can you especially describe the U.S. Council for International Business? Who was it? Who were the people involved or the groups, and how did they differ from other business leaders at the time and even now?
Yes. So first, let me say that the NAM and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce were not actually the organizations of corporate globalizers. They were very attentive to the interests of smaller companies that were their member companies that were not as internationally interested. So they did not take a free trade or pro-globalization position. So it was the U.S. Council that played this role. So the main argument I try to make in the book is to show that globalization was the outcome of a political process, not of a purely economic one. So what was this wave of economic globalization in the second half of the 20th century? Let me first say a few words about that, since this really is at the center of my book. This economic globalization that took place, it basically took off after the 1950s, was a huge increase in worldwide trade and investments. And the markers of this globalization were, on the one hand, the increase of the share that global trade represented in world GDP. So if we take two dates, the end of World War II and 1990, we can see that world trade expanded from 5 to 51% of world output. So a huge increase in the exports and imports of products. But we also have to take into account foreign direct investments. Basically, foreign direct investments are the assets that are owned and controlled by multinational corporations in other countries, especially by establishing subsidiaries or factories abroad. So now if we look at the foreign direct investments, we can see that during the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the part of foreign direct investment outward flows made up in global GDP tripled. So these are two markers that show this extraordinary wave of globalization that took place. And what does that tell us? It tells us that the wealth and the power of multinational companies increased in a truly spectacular manner during this period. So the question that guided my research was, why is that, and how did this happen? How did this take a place? And that is where the group of corporate globalizers that you mentioned in your question came into the picture. So who are these people that I call the corporate globalizers? They are extremely powerful business people, mainly men. Until the 1970s, a few women participate in this group. So business people that head big multinational companies, and they got together in 1945 to create the U.S. Council for International Business and consistently lobby for free market and pro-globalization policies. And this is how they differed from other business leaders, because they considered that it was always right to lower barriers to trade and investment, including for foreign goods and capital coming into the U.S. market. Whereas other business leaders at time favored high tariffs to protect the jobs in the United States.
So there were other business leaders that opposed. There were business groups that opposed further globalization.
Yes, definitely. There was economic nationalism that was promoted by certain business actors, especially during the 50s, and then more recently again.
So it wasn't uniform, but this group was particularly powerful in your view?
Yes, and it was their mission basically to protect the interests of multinational corporations. So the international interests of free trade, free investment, opening foreign markets to the business of these multinational companies.
Did they enter this organization as individuals or as representatives of their companies? And did the companies support the organization, or who's the money behind the organization?
That's an excellent question, and it gets a little more complicated because the U.S. Council cannot be considered the mouthpiece of the companies that were represented through certain of their senior managers who participated in the board of trustees of the U.S. Council. It was much more an organization of individual business leaders who believed in this pro-globalization agenda. So, for instance, to give you an example, Philip Reed, he was probably the most influential corporate globalizer per se. He was the CEO of General Electric, a huge multinational company after World War II. And the president of General Electric, Ralph Cordiner, at the same time, he was the president as Reed was the CEO, and Cordiner advocated for a rigorously protectionist agenda. So the two men oversaw the operations of the same multinational company, yet one, Reed, believed that globalization was the way to go, while the other one was convinced that U.S. workers needed to be protected from globalization, from foreign competition. So whether or not an executive decided to become a trustee of the U.S. Council was a question of belief and ideology, and not simply an act in the interests of his or her company. But when we look at the bigger picture, there is no doubt that the companies that these executives in the U.S. Council headed profited from the policies that they promoted, because it was thanks to this removal of obstacles to their international dealings that these companies became giant corporations during the second half of the 20th century.
Was their aim to increase the profitability of their companies primarily, or were they guided by economic ideology? You know, if you take a course in economics, you almost always hear the praises of free trade, the old argument between Adam Smith and going back to the 18th century where he was arguing for free trade. Was this ideological, or was it self-interest motivated, or some combination of the two? Hard to disentangle.
I think the two were really linked, and it's impossible to separate the two, because there was clearly ideology that played a role. There was a belief that it had been economic nationalism that had led to the Great Depression and to the rise of fascism in the 30s, and that free trade and free investment would also lead to world peace. So there was a real belief in what they were advocating for. But at the same time, of course, there were the material interests that were linked to this crusade, because as I just mentioned, their own companies directly profited from the kind of policies that they were promoting.
So it was not so much economic ideology, but actually they were basing it on the 1930s and the war that had occurred, and they believed that globalization would lead to peace. That was at least part of their motivation.
That was definitely part of their motivation when they started out. So they set up the U.S. Council in 1945 with this clear intent, and I think economic ideology played into this their motivations as well.
Do you think that in the corporate world at the time, the majority of large corporations were favoring globalization, or was it more divided? Because historically, I think corporations politically take both sides of issues. It seems they contribute to both political candidates of the left and the right. so that to protect themselves should either side be elected. So in this instance, were they doing both, or was it primarily were they free traders?
So I would say that the majority of big multinational companies, and we're really talking Fortune 100 companies that had subsidiaries all over the world, probably favored pro-globalization free trade policies, although there were some exceptions. And if you look at the composition of the U.S. Council, you can really see that it is these very large companies, or then consulting firms that worked with multinational companies, or insurance companies that also had interests that were linked to multinational companies, that were spending time and money in the U.S. Council.
You could, if you did an empirical study, you could probably say, based on the amount of foreign involvement that these companies previously had, you would find higher levels of support for globalization. They were both protecting their existing interests and trying to advance further their interests through globalization. Might one say that?
Yes, I think you could say that, but the situation also changed over time. So it's always important to keep in mind the historical context, because the big multinational chemical companies, for instance, in the 50s, were very protectionist, because they were competing with imports from European companies, big multinational companies, and so they were in favor of higher tariffs. But then later in the 60s and 70s, these same companies became more free trade oriented, because they had also increased their international reach. They had more in direct investments in Europe and other places in the world, and so they became more free trade and pro-globalization at that time.
Interesting. So, there was the U.S. Council for International Business. Was it the central organization, and was it the most prominent, or were there other organizations involved at the time who also were promoting free trade as well as opposing free trade? In other words, why focus on this organization in particular? Was it the most prominent?
It was definitely the most prominent. It was the only big business association that consistently represented the interests of multinational companies. So multinational companies also were members of the other big business associations, such as NAM or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but their international interests were represented. Their globalization interests were represented by the U.S. Council. And it is the U.S. Council which, until today, represents all of U.S. American business in the International Labor Organization, in the UN, and through the International Chamber of Commerce, in the OECD. So it's definitely the central and main business association for multinational corporations.
So it still exists today, and it's still active today.
It's still very active today, and it hasn't changed much, whether in policies nor in. If you look at the board of trustees today, it's still made up of the CEOs and presidents of the main multinational corporations in the United States.
How does it maneuver, given the Trump administration's opposition to free trade and its pro-tariff policies? Are you continuing to follow it today? And
yes, but of course I don't have access to the historical archives as for the prior period. But what they seem to be doing is very much what they did during the first Reagan administration. The first Reagan administration also adopted high tariff protectionist policies. And Reagan wasn't the favorite candidate of the U.S. Council members, or the corporate globalizers, but they sort of stayed discreet during those years. They didn't make any big policy announcements or steps against the protectionist policies. So they could deal with this administration. I think the same is probably happening today. And what you also have to keep in mind that other aspects of the Trump administration's policies very much benefit these same business leaders. For instance, tax cuts, corporate tax cuts are, of course, in favor of their interests. So even if I'm pretty sure they're not happy about the high tariff policies, they probably still.
They're keeping a lower profile so that they don't get bullied by this administration. And that is surprising, actually, that during the Reagan administration, despite the free market ideology, that they had pro-tariff policies. I wasn't aware of that. That's quite interesting. So, how would you judge the legacy? I mean, because there was this post-war group of organizations that were created that did try to, like the Marshall Plan, the GATT, the WTO. They we're moving away from them very rapidly in the world today, but they did act. There were positive things that they did. So how would you judge this overall? Were these people visionaries, or were they just self-interested elites? And what relationship is there to in the immediate post-war period to Cold War rhetoric? How did that play a role in what they were doing?
Yes, so these corporate globalizers were very much a part of this whole process of establishing multilateral organization, a multilateral framework for trade in the immediate post-war years. First of all, the Marshall Plan, U.S. Council members really decisively helped establish the Marshall Plan, which was the biggest foreign aid package in history. And actually two founding members of the U.S. Council, Averell Harriman and William Clayton, were part of the Truman administration. They were in charge of international economic policy. So from the inside of the Truman administration, they helped bring about the Marshall Plan and then help it pass congressional approval. And then another example which shows this direct participation of these businessmen in the international policies of the Truman administration is that once it's set up, the Marshall Plan, the administrator who is put in place at the head of the Marshall Plan administration is actually a founding member of the U.S. Council, as well as Paul Hoffman, a car maker. And then you have the OECD, which comes out of the Marshall Plan. And again, this is, of course, in line with the objectives of the corporate globalizers. Always this idea to liberalize trade, to liberalize European markets. And until today, the U.S. Council represents American business at the OECD.
But to a large extent, I mean, they're elites in U.S. society, and there's a kind of revolving door between this organization and policy-making roles, so they could actually implement the policies that they were advocating for.
Yes, it was definitely not only lobbying from the outside, but there were always corporate globalizers that were part of the different administrations. So it had a direct influence from inside the government.
Are there any of them today who've all?
Let me add, to different degrees during different administrations.
Sure. In the current administration, I would imagine they're absent, but that's beyond the scope of your book. I understand. So what about the opposition? When did it start? In the 1970s, and did it include organized labor and leaders from the global South? What was their motivation? Was it defense of fairness, democracy? Did they want to balance globalization and make it more equitable? What was their motivation, and how did the opposition arise?
Yes, so in the 1970s, organized laborers and actors in the global South started to challenge these incredibly powerful players that multinational companies have become over the past 2 decades. So this was really an era of new anti-globalization critique. In the book, I talk about this movement as the first anti-globalization movement compared to the second one that starts in 1999 in Seattle. And so there were different international attempts to establish mandatory rules for multinationals, be it on employment, on environmental protection, to keep them from interfering in the internal affairs of the host countries, or, for example, from collaborating with racist regimes in Southern Africa. And the most serious such attempt to set up rules for multinational corporations took place in the UN, which set up the United Nations Commission on Transnational Corporations in 1975. So there was this alliance of interests happening between policymakers in the global South. They had support from Eastern Bloc countries because we are in a Cold War setting, and organized labor. So organized labor in the 70s had begun questioning free trade, which was new. It had not done so in the 50s and the first half of the 60s. So they began criticizing the effects of free trade and of unlimited foreign direct investments. So they have become critical of the fact that multinationals were outsourcing jobs to lower income countries in Europe or in the global South. So their aim was definitely to achieve better working conditions, fairer salaries, to protect populations in poor countries from the power of these huge corporations. It was clearly a missed opportunity to achieve a fairer globalization. What is important, and I try to discuss this in the book, is why these efforts ultimately failed. And it was in large part because of business lobbying and organizing by these corporate globalizers and by other groups of organized business, because there is very much effort that is put into this campaign to weaken the efforts to achieve a binding code of conduct on multinationals within the United Nations.
That's the main aim, to assure that workers when the jobs were outsourced, that the workers were protected in these other countries, so that there would be greater equivalency between working conditions in more advanced countries and less advanced countries, or was it what led to this recognition actually, and who were the people who came upon it? Because they seem like they were getting at something that only now has become very prominent.
Basically, there were different motivations in the different parts of this anti-globalization movement. For labor unions in the United States or in Europe, the main aim was probably not to protect the populations in the global South, but to protect the workers in the United States and in Western Europe. Workers who were losing jobs and were in competition with the workers in the subsidiaries and in the factories that multinational companies were setting up abroad.
So it was outsourcing of jobs primarily that they were
mainly outsourcing of the jobs that motivated the labor unions, whereas the global South politicians, of course, had the problem of subsidiaries in their own countries basically not being controlled by any political structure. So the aim was to be able to enforce certain regulations on these multinational companies in their own country.
Did they actually were the reports written at the time that documented the exodus of jobs from the United States. It will be very interesting to look at those, I think, today in retrospect, that there was already a consciousness that this was occurring. Did you find such reports that documented it, and who was writing it? How were they? Because I would assume also that the corporate leaders could draw much more on scholars and think tanks than the labor unions, and they wouldn't have the same kind of analytical capabilities to challenge what was going on, or did they?
Actually, at the beginning of the 70s, the AFL-CIO becomes very active on this issue, and also tries to push legislation in the United States, to promote legislation to regulate multinational corporations. And there are reports on, for instance, on differences in wages being paid in different industries in the United States and also in European countries. That's something that was surprising to me, that in the 1970s, there's a real wage difference between certain countries in Europe, such as Italy, and the United States.
And so the AFL mostly was in touch with the Democratic forces within the Democratic Party, I assume, but the Democratic Party didn't fully adopt this agenda. If I think about the 1990s in particular, the Democratic Party became fairly pro-trade. Is that correct? So do you have any insight into why the Democratic Party abandoned or did not fully support the AFL and the labor unions?
In the 1990s, it's the New Democrats become very influential in the United States, amongst which Bill Clinton, of course, is a leading figure, and he starts to, and these New Democrats have a new discourse on free trade and on globalization, where they basically say globalization is a positive thing, is a good thing, but we need to protect the world population from certain negative effects of globalization. So in the 1990s, the situation has changed. The labor unions are less combative, maybe in the 1990s than they were in the 1970s. But at the end of the 1990s, there's a second new anti-globalization movement that arises, critical of outsourcing of jobs and in solidarity with people in the global South. But it is not, you were right to say it's not the Democratic Party of the United States. It's less the labor unions, and it's more grassroots movements, NGOs that play an important role in this wave of anti-globalization.
And like, it's surprising that countries in the global South would oppose it, because it on the one, it does bring jobs to and creates economic stimulus for countries in the global South. But were they opposed to it, or were they? I guess it depends. How did that work itself out?
Yes, you really have to look at each country individually, because there was no such thing as the global South speaking with one voice, of course. So it depended on the different national contexts. For instance, Allende in Chile was very critical of the actions of multinationals and tried to also establish alliances with labor in Europe and in North America. But so within the UN, as such, the whole third world movement in the 1970s was behind this agenda of establishing a binding code of conduct. So the big difference was that they wanted regulations that could actually be enforced. And so multinational companies, on the other hand, mainly supported by European governments and the US government, said, okay, we can have a code of conduct, but it shouldn't be binding. It should be basically multinationals should be able to self-regulate, establish their own oversight. So that was the main division between the two agendas.
Yeah, I mean, this notion of the difference between self-regulation and mandatory requirements is something I've written about in a paper that we did, but with regard to environmental regulation, mostly. But what about China? What did China? Was it China actually benefited immensely from the outsourcing? So was it? What stance was it taking? I'm sure it changed over time. But when China opened up, did they did they did they did they insist on any standards that should exist, or how did China approach this?
Well, China in the 1990s was very actively pursuing a free trade policy and wanted to join the WTO, which it did. I think if I remember correctly, in 95. So China had become part of this multilateral trade framework. And that's also the time when direct investments in China start to increase very dramatically. So multinational companies in the US or in Europe start to set up subsidiaries in China during this time.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's another book that came out recently about Apple and how Apple played a huge role in training the Chinese and providing them with a lot of the intellectual capital that allowed the Chinese factories to begin, because they understood how important that would be ultimately. In any case, but so it seems like there was some blockage or preventing of the progress of globalization, because the NAFTA and the WTO were triumphs, but later efforts like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a Pacific Rim trade deal, and the TTIP, a proposed U.S.-EU trade pact, failed. So were the forces against globalization then able to mobilize and have an impact, and there were shifting values that blocked further business-driven globalization? When did that occur, and how did that take place?
So since the turn of the century, 95, there was this big triumph of establishing the WTO, which was really can be considered as a globalization agency with enhanced powers. So that was a very important moment for the corporate globalizers. They wanted to go on to continue in this same direction. They had further projects for globalization. For instance, to better protect their investments, their direct investments abroad, protect these investments against nationalizations or against environmental regulation, was one of their aims. But these projects did not really move on as they would have hoped, in part because of this second anti-globalization movement. I think it's always very important to take into account the role that historical actors played in these contexts. And then there was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which also made things worse from the perspective of corporate globalizers. So there was this pushback at the turn of the century against WTO type of globalization, with this movement that took off in Seattle in 1999, with huge protests against what was called neoliberal globalization. There are also protests in Davos in Switzerland against the World Economic Forum meetings that took place after 99. And these different historical actors, these movements were challenging the fairness, or were questioning the fairness of globalization, and pointed to the rising inequalities that it brought with it. And they also challenged the free trade agreements that you mentioned. So there was a certain setback of the projects of the agenda of the corporate globalizers to go even further in freeing the circulation of capitals and goods worldwide. But I think it has to be it shouldn't be exaggerated, this setback, because if you look at the current foreign direct investment figures of multinational companies, of U.S. multinational companies, since the turn of the century until today, they have increased almost threefold in real value. So inflation taken into account, they are now worth $6.83 trillion. That's U.S. foreign direct investments. So that's definitely not a real standstill of the process of economic expansion of these multinational.
Isn't the U.S. also a beneficiary of FDI? I mean, there's a lot of foreign direct investment in the U.S. as well, especially today, or it's beginning to recede, but the Chinese and the Japanese, the Middle Eastern countries, they've made huge FDI investments in the U.S. So it's going both ways, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that was also something which historically corporate globalizers always welcomed and fought for, that foreign direct investment from abroad should be able to come into the United States without any hurdles, whereas other economic actors in the United States wanted to block foreign direct investments in the United States. What's interesting is that this economic integration, so foreign direct investments happening from the US towards Europe or towards the outside world, and from the outside world to the United States, is essentially still happening between North America and Western Europe. So I can't give you the percentages now, but it is in great majority these foreign direct investments are taking place in the transatlantic sphere, which is interesting. And it
makes a lot of sense, actually. And it also, it seems from your depiction is that in 1998, the opposition was coming mostly from the left or progressive elements in U.S. society. And there was a rift, I guess, within the Democratic Party itself. But today it's coming from nationalist elements that are on the right. When did they join the anti-globalist campaigns? Is that? Do you have any comments about that?
Yes, basically, this opposition to globalization from the populist right, I would call it, which is not an opposition to globalization as a whole, but to certain aspects of globalization. That there's the will to make globalization more conform with certain national interests, I would say. So in the United States, this started with Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan in the 1990s. At first, it was focused on NAFTA, opposition to NAFTA. So again, to a multilateral free trade agreement. And this new opposition from the populist right, held globalization responsible for the loss of blue-collar jobs in the Rust Belt. That was in the 1990s. And then after the 2007-2008 financial crisis and the beginning of the Tea Party movement, the framing of this negative assessment of globalization changed somewhat. It was no longer multinational companies that were held responsible for the negative effects of globalization, but it was democratic elites and corrupt politicians that were blamed for this globalization. And the MAGA movement and Donald Trump took up this discourse on the negative effects of globalization, and also a criticism of these of the multinational trade framework. So especially of the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
So how did the U.S. Council for International Business respond to to the growing opposition, especially on the right, I would say? Did they just kind of hide from it, or did they directly confront the opposition to trade? What was their...
The U.S. Council for International Business was the only main big business association in the United States that actively fought the China tariffs, for example, the tariffs that the first Trump administration had established.
They fought against them.
China fought against them, yes. So they set up different business alliances, and they did big hearings, and they wanted the government to get rid of these high tariffs, whereas the other big business associations, like such as the NAM or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, did not play this same role.
It's interesting. And
sorry.
Do they continue to fight against the tariffs that are of today's tariffs? I mean, when you listen to the business media, which I do a lot, and it seems to me that major economists today, like almost uniformly, think that the Trump's tariffs and the way he's going about that are incredibly foolish, let's say, at a minimum, and destructive. So have they continued this opposition today? Are they still very active against are they being bullied and afraid to push their agenda?
They certainly continued during the Biden administration, because Biden did not get rid of tariffs as they would have hoped.
Right, he didn't pull back. Right,
mm-hmm.
Right.
Since Trump's return to power, I haven't seen much public manifestations of the U.S. Council. So again, I can make this parallel with the Reagan administration in the early 80s. I imagine they are still, of course, opposed to this agenda, because it's in opposition to what they have been promoting since 1945, lowering tariffs, fighting economic nationalism. So I'm convinced that they still have the same political agenda, but that they're sort of keeping quiet right now.
Agonize or get on the wrong side of Trump, and
mm-hmm.
In fact, Peter Navarro, who when I was in graduate school, he had an office nearby my little cubbyhole. And I actually, at that time, did not think he would become such a toxic figure, but that's a whole other story. But how do they deal, like the U.S. Council and the pro-globalization forces within the corporate community? What's their approach to industrialization of the Rust Belt and the loss of U.S. jobs? Do they have any kind of compensatory mechanisms, or do they advocate for anything to deal with both political backlash, and even the financial hardship that it has caused many people in many regions in the United States?
I think the main reaction of the corporate globalizers to this problem of deindustrialization and the loss of manufacturing jobs is the promotion of the discourse on corporate social responsibility. So the corporate social responsibility to promote sustainable development, for instance, United Nations Global Compact Initiative 2000, which included multinational corporations. Again, the U.S. Council played an important role alongside NGOs and labor unions and civil society groups, with this idea that they could promote corporate sustainability on a purely voluntary basis. So we have this idea of self-regulation again. So I'd say that the answer of the corporate globalizers to these problems is continue the dynamics of globalization and free trade and free investments, but engage in these initiatives of social.
Social responsibility then would be kind of uniform throughout the world, and there would be common standards. So country could not gain competitive advantage from the labor perspective by having lower standards. I guess that's their rationale or the kind of argumentation that they would be making. Very interesting. So the motivation behind this, I'm sure it's hard to pull out, but I think the motivation for globalization, and as a teacher of strategy in business schools, but also somebody who's been very involved in promoting corporate social responsibility. But I think that in business schools, in general, we are pro-globalization. I think in the way we teach, but there are many motivations. It's to expand markets. It's to provide access to raw materials. It's supply chains to provide access to supply chains. And it's also to provide access to cheap labor. I mean, is this all part of the motivation, or are there elements of it that have greater emphasis and priority, at least in your research that you did on the U.S. Council? Do you understand my question? It's a little bit. It's not. What are the real? Is it everything then, or are there specific elements with it that are really the higher priorities among the corporate elites that have been pro-globalization?
So basically, if you look at the minutes of the meetings when the executive committee of the U.S. Council gets together, and as a historian, I work with these archival sources, so I see the discussions that took place between these business leaders. Their focus is clearly on promoting this free trade agenda. That's what matters to them, and they discuss how best to do it and how to fight protectionist policies, different protectionist policies, how to intervene on an international scale in different international organizations to always to promote the same idea of opening markets. So I think I don't really focus on the question whether the actions of these business leaders were ethical. I think it's more important to think about what kind of a framework of political structures could be put into place to steer globalization into a direction of greater social and economic equality, into a direction that would take into account the interests of a majority of the world's population, or that would help protect the environment. So if you see what I mean, I think that's the more important. I don't think even the anti-globalization movement that started in Seattle did not like the label anti-globalization. They said we are for globalization, but it has to be a globalization that is fair, that takes questions of equality into account, etc.
So from a policy perspective, that's what you would probably yourself advocate for. You would advocate, you're not anti-globalization, but you're for fair globalization. And that's what would have to happen.
I would say, I look at it as a historian, what I think the structures that were put into place led to greater inequality in the world today than did before. So they are clearly not.
If we were to evaluate this net, and I think this is it's going to be an ongoing debate, and there will be a great, in terms of global welfare overall, there are definitely victims, but there are also, like, the global GDP has risen substantially, and there are many, many people in the world who probably have benefited from globalization outside the U.S. A lot of the victims are in the United States. I don't expect you to have a full answer to this, but it seems to be almost even an ethical conundrum that that people in this country are suffering because of globalization, while people globally, there may have been advances made had it not been for globalization for the welfare of people throughout the world. Or do you disagree with the argument I'm making?
Maybe I can mention the work of Piketty on global inequality, which I find very, very interesting, and which maybe provides part of the answer to that question. So growing global inequality.
Okay, so you think the growing global inequality is much greater than the positive benefits that may have accrued from globalization, from free trade. Overall, that would be the. I know this isn't a conclusion in your book. We're going beyond it. I don't want to force you, but at least you would point that out. You at least qualify its benefits.
Yes, I think it always depends for whom was it beneficial, for which groups, and for whom did it bring inequality. So, of course, if you look at it from a perspective of the multinational companies and of the business leaders of the multinational companies, I'd say the question is very quickly answered. It was globalization was beneficial.
What about China? Like the average Chinese person today, haven't they benefited from globalization? Of course, I mean, China has always imposed unfair tariffs against other countries, but still, I think the average person in the world today is probably somewhat better off because of globalization. That's my. I couldn't make this argument, empirically. It's just my impression that I think that there has been advancements that occurred because of globalization. Like if we think back in the 1930s, a lot of the reason why the depression persisted and even got worse was because of putting up walls against globalization, and the people in the U.S. Council were partially reacting to that. And so globalization has brought benefits globally, although there have been many, many victims. That's the way I see it. So you may disagree. What would be your conclusion? How would you view it?
I think it's not really the question I'm looking at, because as a historian, what it's how did it happen? Who made it happen? How did it work? Why was there this gigantic wave of globalization, etc.? So I suppose that's the way I look at it.
I can't get you to sum up the lesson, or should we see globalization as progress, exploitation, or something more complicated? You're documenting what happened rather than evaluating it. I don't want to force you to evaluate it, by the way, because documenting it is very important.
I analyzed empirical evidence that I found in the historical archives. I would say that what is clear, and maybe that answers your question somewhat, what is clear to me after having done this research and written this book, is that globalization, the way it took shape during the last decades of the 20th century, has contributed to accumulating wealth in the hands of a minority of companies, big multinational companies and business leaders, which does not mean that there was no alternative route that globalization could have taken.
So maybe the alternative route is what we miss. There is a missed opportunity with the alternative route. It isn't globalization per se that is negative, but it's the way it was pursued without standards, without safeguards. If I'm putting words in your mouth, I mean, because today it's been taken over by this populist right, and it's the tariff movement is just so incredibly poisonous at this moment. That's my point of view. So that I think it's almost important to fight for globalization at this moment rather than to be opposed to it.
I think it's important to keep in mind that the populist right does not challenge this multilateral trade framework in order to achieve greater equality or better protection for the environment, but their aim is to make it more beneficial to certain parts of the national economy, basically. So since that is the aim, that the agenda that is behind this attack on this multilateral globalization framework, it is very clear to me that the outcome cannot be a correction of the downsides of this process of globalization, but that
if every country retreated and became protectionist, I think everybody in the world would be worse off. That's my view. And we're seeing that happen to a certain extent. But anyhow, so what are you working on right now?
I am working on several different projects, which all involve the role of organized business. For one, I am studying how the political project of neoliberalism has advanced since the 1980s, especially in relation to business groups and think tanks, business think tanks. Then I've also been looking into environmental regulation and the climate crisis in the history of capitalism. And finally, a new area of research I have taken up is that of business conservatism in the United States after the 1980s, so leading up to the Tea Party and Trump.
Excellent choices of things to look at this moment. Very, very important. And I mean, neoliberalism is being attacked, and climate crisis is being ignored, and so these are very, very important things to look at. So I really appreciate your work that you've done, and we probably should bring this to an end. And it's been a great conversation. Thank you for joining me today, Janick. Your book reminds us that globalization was not an unstoppable force of nature, but the product of choices that were made by powerful actors that still shape our economy and society. At the heart of this history lies a question that continues to challenge us. Can globalization truly serve the many, or it would always remain the project of a few? You've been listening to the New Books Network. I'm Alfred Marcus, and today we've been discussing Crusading for Globalization. It's a really fascinating book, very well researched, very important for us to understand the history of this phenomenon. Thank you for joining us, Janick. And until next time, keep reflecting on how strategy and ethics shape the world we live in.
Thank you very much.